Everyone, welcome to my channel. For today, I wanted to do a video dedicated to the new Makeup Forever HD Skin Face Essentials palette. So this has been one of my favorite products of late. I picked this up in the Sephora VIB sale during their spring sale, and I found myself using this like almost every single time I do makeup. I have to kind of actively decide to wear something else. And so since I've gotten a lot of experience with this palette lately, I wanted to do a full video with swatches, applying all of the shades to my face and sharing with you my impressions now that I've gotten a decent amount of time to test this out. In addition, before I picked up this palette, I really was loving this HD Skin Sculpting face palette, and so I'll do some comparisons as well in case any of you are looking into both of these and aren't sure which one to pick up. So if you're interested in these palettes, then just stick around. So to start off, let's just talk about the packaging. So this is nice, sleek metal packaging that shows all of the shades on the outside. There's a click enclosure here, so you just press the button and it opens up. And the way this palette is designed, on this side you have the base products. So you have 4 shades that are meant to be kind of complexion products, concealer, plus foundation. And then you have a cool toned contour shade and a warm toned bronzer. And then on this side you have 2 highlighters up here, a champagne highlight and a rosy highlight. And then you have 4 blush shades. This product is made in Japan. And in general, these palettes were kind of originally designed, I think, with makeup artists in mind. It's sort of inspired by the types of palettes that makeup artists would use. But I think this newest curation is really reflecting the fact that Makeup Forever saw a lot of folks interested in this for everyday use. And so they did release 2 different colorways. This is the light to medium, and then they also have a medium to deep. So if you have a deeper skin tone, definitely go for that one. I would say this one kind of tops out really at sort of just a little bit deeper than my skin tone. I mainly use these 2 shades over here. So if you have a deeper skin tone, you can definitely focus on these 2. But any deeper than this, you should go for the medium to deep colorway. So before we get into the swatches, let me just talk a little bit about this formula to start. So what really got me interested in these palettes in general is, for one, I saw a lot of great reviews, but what sealed the deal for me was actually swatching this guy in store. So in general, Makeup Forever is really good at complexion products. Before this, I picked up their Ultra HD foundation. I picked it up in the older formulation, so I haven't tried the newer one. But I really was very impressed with that foundation because the first time I tried it, I put a few layers on and I was so confused why it still looked like there was nothing on my skin. It didn't look like I had foundation on. But when I looked at my skin as a whole, it was pretty clear that everything was much more perfected and I did get decent coverage. It was just very imperceptible. And I feel like that's the case with this formula too. You can basically build this up quite a bit for coverage on your skin and it still looks very natural. Or you can just have a very light sheer layer. It's really good for providing that sort of finish that's very skin-like, doesn't look either too luminous in an unnatural way or too dry and matte. And in general, I would say the formulations in these palettes are just super easy to work with as a result, because they sheer out really nicely, but they also build up nicely. And so you can really get a wide variety of looks with them, even if you're someone who's not that expert in your makeup application. These are just really easy to use. So now let's get into swatching. I'm gonna start from lightest to deepest over here. So we're gonna go in with this shade first, then this one, and this one over here. And this first one is one I usually start out with kind of to brighten up certain areas of my face. It is very light, so I think if you have a very light complexion, you can still use this palette focusing on this shade. The next shade is the one that I tend to use sort of all over the face. It's a little bit deeper than the inside of my arm, but is a pretty good match for my face. This does have a rosy, cool undertone to it though, so it's not the best undertone match for me, given that I have a neutral to yellow leaning undertone. The next shade is one I like putting on my forehead, so it's a bit deeper and it has more of a neutral, slightly yellow undertone to it, so its warmer tone works better with my complexion and is a really good match for my forehead. This last shade over here is one I actually don't really use at the moment, but I think in the summertime I might get some more use out of it. So these are the main 4 complexion shades in the palette. And I think if you're like me and you have a light medium skin tone, you can make use of pretty much all of these shades at various points of the year. Now for comparison, I also want to swatch some of these, since this original contour palette that I got is really good if you have my complexion. The undertones of this palette match a lot better than the new palette, at least for me. So that's why I still like using this palette, even though it's a little bit less versatile. So let me just swatch the first 4 shades over here. And for me, all 4 of these work really well for my skin tone. So I find that this palette is really easy to use if you have my complexion. So as you can see here, the lightest shades are actually pretty similar between these 2. And in terms of these shades over here, you can see there's more of a jump over here. Like each one of these is a clear, different depth, whereas all 3 of these are kind of similar in depth. It's more the undertone that's different. This one's peachy, this one's more yellow, and this one's slightly deeper and a little bit more rosy. But for me, all 3 of these work really well on my face. And I will say these 3 are a little bit better of a match for me than this shade over here. So if you're someone who doesn't really like cream blush and you have a complexion similar to mine, this palette might be better for you. Now I'm just going to swatch these 2 as well, because this palette only comes in 1 colorway, and so it does have these 2 additional shades over here that are meant to be complexion shades. So if you have a deeper skin tone than me, you'll be focusing on these 2. Though honestly, I think if you have a deeper skin tone, it's probably best just to get the deeper version of this new palette, because only having these 2 shades is kind of limiting. Like you can definitely mix and match, but personally what I love about this palette is I don't have to actually cocktail anything. I can just use these 4 shades directly, and I think if you do have to cocktail things, it just makes it a lot less convenient. Now we do also have these 2 deeper shades over here, but if these are your complexion shades, of course you won't be able to use them for contour. So we have over here a cool toned contour shade and then this bronzer shade. For me, I can use these 2 as bronzer. This one is a little bit more red in undertone. This one's a little bit more orangey. So depending on your preference, you do have some options there. Now going back to the new palette, let's go into these 2 equivalent shades here. So we have the bronzer and the contour. And you can see these are pretty similar to these 2. I don't think there's really much of a difference at all. So you definitely don't need both of these palettes by any means. Part of the reason I'm doing these comparisons for you guys is I want to save you money if you are looking at these 2, because both of them are definitely not needed. Now let's go into the highlighters. Since I have this here already, I'm going to first start with the new palette. So we have the champagne highlight and then this pinky highlight. In general, this formula is pretty subtle in terms of highlights, so it's pretty great for the trend where you just want sort of glowy skin, but you don't want any sort of beaming highlight. This is also my preference at the moment in terms of highlighters. The contour palette comes with 4 highlights here, so a little bit more versatile, but honestly, personally, I feel like there's not enough difference between all 4 of these to necessarily warrant having this many in your collection. But of course, I'm gonna swatch all of them for you guys today from lightest to deepest. We have this super bright one, this more golden one, this warm gold, and then this bronzy highlight. So you can see those 4 there. Let me actually turn down the brightness so you can see this a little bit better. So the 2 in the new palette are a little bit more kind of natural looking on the skin, whereas you have a wider range in the old palette. Personally though, with the old palette, I mostly go for the champagne highlight anyway, which is kind of similar to the new one. The new one is more peachy than this one, so there's definitely differences. None of these are like dupes for each other, but they all are pretty sheer on the skin, with the exception of this guy, which can be built up to look a little bit more like a blush, at least on my complexion. And here is also the other swatches in that lower light, in case this is helpful. So again, we have the 4 shades in the new palette. We have the complexion shades in the old palette, plus these 2 contour bronze shades, the bronzer contour in the new palette. So to summarize, I would say that you definitely don't need both of these palettes if you have a similar complexion to myself. I think if you have a deeper skin tone, it's a no-brainer that you should get the deeper version of this one, because I don't think this old one is the most versatile for people with deeper skin tones. That said, if you have a light medium skin tone like myself, I would say that it really just comes down to how you feel about cream blushes. So if you really like the versatility of this sort of setup, then of course this is the way to go. But if you're someone who just has one go-to blush anyway that you would be using outside of these palettes, then I think this one is better from the perspective of a pure complexion palette, just because it has more versatility in terms of undertones. So bringing you guys closer, let's get into the demo of the shades. So I have two brushes that I like to use with this palette. The main one is the BK Beauty 109 brush. I find that this is perfect for really applying any sort of cream complexion product. I also have my Zoeva 110 brush. So one thing I will mention with this palette is these pans are kind of small, so you will want to have a brush kind of a similar size to this. You can see that the edges are a little bit dirty just because when I'm putting this brush in, it still does kind of smear a little bit. So that's the one thing I don't 100% love about this palette. It does get a little bit messy, and because you can't use a big brush, it does take a little bit more time to apply your complexion. But personally, I don't have a very large face, so I don't find it that inconvenient. But just did want to mention that if you are someone who wants to do your makeup really fast, this might be a little bit more time consuming. So to start off, let's go into the lightest shade with my Zoeva 110. And I'm just going to put this in the under eye area. I like to use this one just to kind of brighten up certain parts of my face, mainly the center of my face. One thing I do like about this palette is I feel like I do a lot more steps in terms of sculpting when I use this than I normally would, just because it's much easier. So I would never kind of use so many different shades on my face, but because it's all here, it's like, why not? And it just kind of elevates the makeup look. So I also find that I'm actually able to use this palette without any additional concealer, which really impressed me because these aren't super high coverage formulas. I would say they're more of a medium coverage, but you can definitely build them up, and especially if you do sort of layering like I will today, then I think it's really good for most makeup days. It's not going to give you a completely flawless look that you could get with concealer, but if you don't mind some blemishes peeking through, I think this works well. So there's the lightest shade. You can see it is pretty brightening on my face, so I will go over this with the other shades, but I feel like underpainting with some of that just gives a bit more dimension to the face. So now I'm switching over to my 109 brush and going into the second shade. And I'm going to put this over most of my face. As you can see, this is kind of the best depth level for my current skin tone. It is a little bit rosy on my skin. Let me actually lower the brightness even more, so hopefully you guys can see that a bit. But overall, as you can see, the nature of this formula is it is very imperceptible. So I find that even if the shade's a tiny bit off, the formulation still makes it meld very seamlessly into the skin. Just because from a textural perspective, it's not gonna look artificial. And normally when I use this palette, I actually just use one brush for everything because I'm kind of lazy and I'll just sort of wipe off my brush in between. Today I'll go back and forth between these two brushes just so you guys can kind of see the shades more clearly and I have more of an opportunity to clean off the brushes. But I did just want to mention that because I think that's one of the selling points of this palette. You can just kind of use one brush for everything, and because it's all in the same formulation, everything just melds really easily together, which I personally really enjoy. So there we go. Now we just have a layer of that kind of all over the skin, and overall it's a pretty light layer, but I think you can see that everything just looks a lot more perfected on my skin, but the finish is still very natural and skin-like. So now I'm going to go into the next deepest shade, and I'm going to put this on my forehead because this is basically the perfect shade for my forehead. Hopefully you guys can see a little bit of that, how this area was looking a little bit light on this side, but now on this side, it's kind of blending in a little bit more. The one thing I keep meaning to do with this palette and usually don't do is to not put too many layers on. I feel like I get a little carried away with this palette and end up just adding layers and layers on, which is very easy. But with this shade, I'm just going to put it kind of everywhere on the perimeter of my face to just start adding a little bit more shading and dimension. So everywhere on the outskirts, essentially. And I think what's really fun with this palette is you kind of get that feeling of being a makeup artist and just, you know, going in with these different layers and painting on your face. So I find that to be quite fun. Now this shade I pretty much never use, but for today's demo I will. I'm going to put this primarily again on my forehead. My forehead's going to get a lot more layers than it typically does, but hopefully this helps with, again, some of that multi-dimensional effect. You can see that everything is still pretty subtle, so it doesn't look like I have a lot of makeup on. And then again, just sort of on that chin area, gradually building things up. Now going back in with that Zoeva 110, I'm going into this cool toned contour. This is very cool toned, so this is one I would suggest using on kind of a smaller brush and really concentrating it just in the hollows of your cheeks and maybe your jawline. This is not a shade that I would recommend using on your forehead if you have a similar complexion to me. So hopefully you guys can see that. It's very gray based, so it's definitely going to give you that chiseled effect. You can see that maybe between the two different sides of my face right now. So just going to concentrate this on this side as well. And then take a little bit of this as well on the nose area to add a bit of dimension there. Now because this is very cool toned, I also like to take this with a little bit of this shade as well. So I'm going to dab a tiny bit of that and sort of add it on the nose area too, just to bring a little bit of warmth. And what I like about this formula is it's very forgiving, so even if you aren't very precise, you can sort of blend things out quite easily and get some nice shape going. Going back with my 109 brush, I'm also going to take a little bit of that to bronze up my forehead. This bronzer shade is quite a bit deeper than the complexion shades, so you can definitely get a lot more dimension going in with this. Most days I would say you don't really need all those intermediate steps like I did today. You could just go in with like this shade and this shade if you had my complexion and just call it a day. Of course today I'm just trying to show you guys all of the shades. And there that is also on the hollows of the cheeks. Add a little bit more bronziness. And then whatever's left, I'm just gonna kind of sweep under my jawline. So now let's also go into the highlighter. So this is the highlight I would use kind of all over the face, and this one I would use a little bit more like a blush topper. So first with the Zoeva 110, I'm gonna just take a little bit of the champagne shade and run it along my nose. So you can see that adds a little bit of luminosity there. With the 109 brush, I'm going to take a bit and just put it on the high points of my cheeks, so my forehead and chin. And then after we do the blush, I'll go in with the other one on top. But here we have step one done, so basically just a very sculpted face. And you can see with this one palette, you can pretty much do everything, which I really love. It's just very quick and easy and really fun as well. So now for the blushes. I realized also I did not swatch these for you guys earlier, so let's do the swatches now. So we have 4 shades, and this formula is pretty much the same as the other formulas in this palette, so they blend together very easily, but they're also relatively sheer as a result. So you first have this one shade that is quite glowy. It has a bit of shimmer to it. It's sort of a pinky gold shade. Then you have more of a coral shade, which is a bit punchier and a bit more pigmented. And then you have these two here that are definitely a lot more pigmented than the other two. So you have more of a warm terracotta and a cool berry shade. This one also has a little bit of that shimmer to it. So these are sort of more of the more sheer, more shimmery blushes, whereas these are more pigmented and don't have any shimmer particles in them. So to start, I'm gonna go into this bright pinky shade, and I'm gonna put this on the apple of my cheek here. It's really cute, as you can see. I'm building this up more than I normally would, just so you guys can really see that shade. Like I said, these are kind of sheer, so on the face, they're not gonna look wildly different from each other. So that's why I'm building them up more. But you can see this is a very cute, kind of bubblegummy pink shade. Has some really nice luminosity to it, and also has that slight shimmer. Honestly, I feel like with either of these two blushes, you really don't need any sort of highlight on top, but I will also show that later. And then on the other side, I'm gonna go into this shade, and I did just clean off this brush in between. This way you guys can see both of them. This one is also quite punchy. These two are sort of the brighter shades in the palette, but this one has a little bit more coral oranginess to it, as you can see in pan. And apologies, I have a window there, so I know the two sides of my face kind of look different just due to that lighting. But hopefully you can see a little bit of that difference. Honestly, like I said, on the cheek, it's not like a huge dramatic difference, but hopefully you can at least see that this is more of a warm tone, whereas this is more of a cool tone. This is more pink. This is more kind of coral orange. Okay, cleaning off my brush, I'm going into the terracotta shade. And if you guys watched my first video using this palette, I kind of did a cool tone cheek and a warm tone cheek. Today, I'm gonna mix it up and do it the opposite way, just so you can see the contrast a bit more. So as a result, I'm going into the warmer toned, deeper blush and putting it here next to that cooler toned, lighter blush. And this is a really pretty, more muted shade, as you can see. It's also a bit more pigmented. Definitely packs more of a punch. But all these shades are super easy to use. I really dug in with my brush in order to give you guys this level of pigmentation. But this has sort of a nice brownish burgundy vibe to it, a bit reddish as well. And again, I think everything just blends in super easily because it's all the same formula. So I think that's a major selling point of this palette. Next, let's go into this cool toned berry shade. And again, I really dug in. Let's put this on this side of the cheek. I think this one definitely comes across much cooler. You can see that almost kind of purpley vibe to it. There we go. So again, way more intense than I would normally do, but here we have that deeper berry shade next to that coral shade, and then here we have that pinky shade next to that terracotta shade. And the cheeks are super glowy, so I'm not actually sure how much you're going to be able to see of this highlight shade here, but why not? Let's go in with it. So I'm just going to sweep this on the high points. I don't know if you guys can really see any difference there, but there's now just a little bit more shimmer. Taking more of that, I'm going to put that over here as well, just so we match. But honestly, I don't know that it's really necessary when you put it on top of these products. So there we go. We have everything on my face right now, and you can see that my face is looking super dewy, especially my cheeks. Like, this blush is super, super luminous. If you just leave it like this, it will kind of set more, so it's not going to necessarily look this shiny. But I do personally prefer to set it with some powder. Recently, I've been really enjoying the By Terry powder with this. So I'm going to set half of my face first just so you guys can see the difference. I will say that I'm not sure how well this palette works for people with oily skin types. So I do have a drier skin type, and that's part of why I don't mind that it looks so dewy. If you do have an oily skin type though, this might be a little bit more fussy. But I think once you set it down, everything can be much more mattified. So as you can see, that was just a tiny, tiny bit of powder that I used, and now this side of my face is much more matte in comparison to this side. Let's put a little bit on top of this cheek area as well. Definitely brings down that shine quite dramatically. So there we go. Still has a tiny bit of luminosity peeking through, but I would say way, way more matte than this side. So So really just kind of a matter of preference whether you want to leave things like this or whether you want to set it. For today though, I am going to set both sides of my face just so things look even. So here we are, both sides are set and the complexion is done. So I'm going to go off camera, do the rest of my face, and then be back with my overall thoughts and review. So here we have the final look. I will have all of the products listed in my description box as per usual. I didn't apply any additional complexion, so this is only that one palette. I just went off camera to do brows, eyes, and lips. And in case you guys are interested in what I have on my eyes, I have the Sunlit Seduction palette from McGrath. I'm basically going through all of my Mothership palettes and doing one or more looks for each of them so I can update my rankings. Definitely subscribe and stay tuned if you guys are interested in my updated McGrath Mothership ranking. For today's look, I basically used this as a transition shade, this to deepen up my crease, this all over the eye. And then on the center of the lid, I went in with this shade and some of this in the inner corner, and then this for highlight. So zooming you guys out, let's get into my overall review for this palette. So I overall really love this palette. It's so much fun. I've been using this all the time. As you guys can see, it's really nice how you can just do an entire face with this one palette. Now on most days, I will also go in just with a little bit of powder bronzer and sometimes blush just to further kind of enliven the look. I feel like after powdering everything down, sometimes things look a little bit less saturated than I would normally like. But it also looks really great just as is, like I'm showing you guys today. And so for me, what's been really surprising about this palette and also the other palette is just how much use I've gotten out of this. I really thought this would be mostly a travel palette because you have everything in one place. But I found it's actually really great as well when I'm at home and don't really feel like pulling out a bunch of different products. This basically takes the place of concealer, foundation, contour, bronzer, highlight, and blush. So that's a lot of products in one. This is a pricey palette, but I think if you're like me and you're able to make use of all of these shades, then it is a good deal from that perspective. Overall, what I love most about this palette definitely comes down to the formulation. As you guys can hopefully see on camera, the complexion just looks really great. Like I didn't put any of it on my neck, and so you can maybe see a little bit of the difference there. Everything's just super perfected here, whereas at least in person you can definitely see a bunch of spots still on my neck. My face just looks almost filtered, especially with that By Terry powder on top. And even though I powdered things down, especially the cheeks still look nice and luminous. Now that I powdered, actually, I feel like I can see a little bit more of the effect of that highlight because the highlighter just adds a little bit of that kind of shimmery particle that still stands out even once the dewiness has been mattified. Because this leaves such a natural finish, I find it just works for pretty much any look that I'm doing. There are days when I want more of a matte look or more of a dewy look, but if I just want something in between, then this is really perfect for that. It also means I can take it from sort of a natural sheer look to a much more full glam look like I have today. And so I think that's really unique and very special about this formula. In addition, I find the curation just makes it really fun. I am not a makeup artist. I don't normally mix and match shades when I'm doing makeup, but because a lot of these shades do work for my complexion, it is just kind of fun adding those different layers of depth so you get that much more three-dimensional look to your face. It just kind of reminds me of sort of shading in a drawing. And so if you like to play around with your makeup, I think this is a really fun way to incorporate that element into your everyday looks. Now, as I mentioned, the one downside of this palette is at least if you have the same kind of neutral to yellow leaning undertones that I do, this shade, which is the main shade that I use, is a little bit too rosy on my skin tone. I can still make it work, but it's just not as natural looking as this other palette. So that's the one caveat where I feel like I still do get some use out of this palette as a result. But on the whole, the blushes really tip things over for me with this palette. So I think if I were to just buy one of these today, I would definitely buy this one. So that's it for today's video. I would love to hear in the comments what you guys think about this palette. If you've picked it up, please share your experience in the comments below. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!